Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to show you the last round game from Limone. I was finally happy to play against the Tal Caro-Kann, I have to say. So if you've seen my previous videos in this opening, I didn't score that well, and even when I did, I had some trouble in the games. So before this tournament, I prepared against the Tal variation extensively, and I found something that I didn't really consider a variation, but I found it extremely interesting, and I tried it out in this game, and you're gonna see what happens. So before I continue, I have to say I was really happy to win my third cash prize in a row. So 3 tournaments in a row, I won the prize in the under 2000 section. Actually, in this tournament, I won the prize in the under 2100 section because the player that was in first place under 2100 took one of the other prizes. In any case, I was first up to 2000, so that was my goal, and I managed to achieve it. Okay, so I'm playing a young opponent. I'm gonna say he's 15, 16, something like that, rated 2081. He starts with pawn to e4, and I couldn't really say what he was going to do. I thought Tal was one of the options, but I didn't prepare for that specifically. And also, the morning round, the draw, you could have seen in the last video, I finished at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and this game started at 3, so I had no time to prepare. So d4, d5, e5, bishop f5, h4, the tile. Okay, h5. And in this position, my opponent played c4, which is the main move. Bishop d3 is a whole different story, but against c4, you play e6, they go knight c3. And so far, I've always developed my knights. I've played knight d7 in this position as my main repertoire against the tile. In this game, I tried out bishop to e7. Okay, so this move is very tricky. It's not considered as good as the other 2 moves, but it's really not clear why. Firstly, you're putting pressure on the pawn on h4, and that's something white has to deal with, because if that pawn falls, the main attacking square white usually uses in the tile, g5, can no longer be controlled. So defending the pawn doesn't really work. That has to be mentioned. You cannot just play g3 or something like that, or knight f3. That's very passive. And here's why. If you play something like knight to f3, then white can immediately jump onto the pawn on d4. And you do that by playing bishop to g4. And bishop g4 is going to be a recurring theme in this variation of the tile. Basically, if, for example, bishop to e2, and you take on c4, and eventually you start putting tremendous pressure on the pawn on d4, maybe with knight f5. Even if you don't take, if at some point white takes, then your plan is usually to transfer the knight back to c6 and prove that you have more attackers on d4. Okay, so the way to punish bishop to e7 is to exchange in the center straight away and start putting pressure on black's position. So cd, cd. And here my opponent made a mistake. The way to play this position is bishop to d3. After bishop to d3, this move plays against the idea of bishop to g4. Bishop g4 is now not a good move, because after f3 you have to go back, and then you have no pawn structure. Obviously this is bad for black. So after bishop d3, black has to take, and takes. And after knight c6, you can see that knight f3 defends the pawn sufficiently, so you no longer have the same kind of pressure. You go something like rook c8, and the position should be equal. Maybe slightly better for white, because again, this square can be easily occupied, while at the same time, black cannot easily jump into g4, and even if he does, it's not the same thing. Often there are attacking patterns with knight e6 you have to be aware of, because your pawn is no longer defending g6, and slightly more pleasant for white. But again, a structural weakness in white's camp always gives black a better endgame. So you want to trade off the pieces and put pressure on d4. Again, it's not easy. However, in this position, my opponent played bishop to g5. After this move, and I wasn't really aware of that, black is already better. The engine gives this as almost -1. Why is that? Well, After I played a6. a6 is a prophylactic move that simply prevents knight to b5 and bishop to b5. Mainly knight b5 because, for example, if I don't do anything, let's just say knight c6, and this is traded off, and takes, and knight b5. This is unpleasant. For the moment I have queen a5, and that's okay. The knight would have to drop back, or the queen goes to d2. But if I don't do anything, for example, I castle, and this knight comes into d6, this is just a monster piece. Therefore, a6 is a simple prophylactic idea. Okay, here my opponent made another mistake, which I didn't exploit. He played knight f3, and in fact, since my knight is still on b8, which is good when cd happens, I can develop it to c6 straight away. I don't have to move back and then go to c6. Bishop g4 was good here straight away. I'd considered it, but I didn't want to neglect my development before I start attacking him. I still wasn't feeling very secure in this position. Maybe queen a4, maybe bishop b5. After that, my rook is still loose. I just didn't want to be pinned anywhere. And I figured, okay, I may have time for bishop g4 later. In fact, after bishop g4 here, simply threatening to win the knight, white plays bishop e2, you take. You can take the pawn straight away, but it's kind of scary. I looked at stuff like this. Obviously, I saw that I could win a pawn, but the position wasn't easy to play. So for example, if bishop g5 takes and queen takes, white has the very annoying queen to b3. And in this position, you cannot play queen e7, which seems like a sensible move. If you play queen e7, white wins on the spot. Try to figure out why. I'm going to show you. So you have to play either b5 or rook to a7. And if you have to play rook a7, then that seems kind of strange. I honestly don't want my rook on a7, even if I win the pawn. So if you play queen e7, why do you lose? Well, bishop takes d5. And once your center crumbles, of course, if you don't take the bishop, then, well, why do you trade the h pawn for the d pawn? And if you take the bishop, then you lose. Knight takes d5 after queen b7, knight b6. So yeah, that wouldn't work. So after bishop g4, taking and taking and taking doesn't mean that you win a pawn. It means that you develop sensibly and then eventually put pressure on d4, which is now much easier since the knight is no longer on f3. But instead of that, I played knight c6 first. I didn't want to go into any of those lines. I just wanted to develop. Okay, my opponent played rook c1. Here, the engine thinks black is winning, which again, I wasn't aware of. This variation I didn't see. I analyzed the game afterwards without the engine, and I saw this, and I calculated it. But again, I didn't think black was winning. I thought black was better. The engine gives this as almost -2 if you play the correct move, which is to take on g5. And now on hg5 you have bishop g4, winning the pawn simply. There is no longer any of that stuff on d5 because the knight has been developed. So I don't know what to suggest. I think maybe g6 is the best move, trying to disrupt black's structure, but even that doesn't really work. Bishop e2 and takes. And simply queen to b6 puts pressure on both pawns, and it's impossible to defend everything. And after bishop g5, if knight g5, then simply queen to b6, and again, one of these is going to fall. There's absolutely no pressure on the black position. Unfortunately, I didn't play bishop g5 during the game. I played queen b6, which I thought was good, preparing bishop to g4. Now, if white does nothing, then bishop g4 is the same idea, but with no complications. Of course, I was expecting knight a4, which my opponent did play. And before playing queen b6, I calculated for a long time. And I was calculating the defense of my b7 pawn tactically, which was really hard to visualize without moving the pieces. Fortunately for me, I calculated it correctly, and my opponent, when we were analyzing after the game, told me that he had missed the move I played, which I found before queen b6, so I was really happy to do that. Okay, here I prepared bishop to b4, and after bishop to d2, which is basically the only move, I think, because if knight d2, I take on d4. If queen d2, I win the queen. If knight back to c3, I achieved what I wanted to achieve, and I can play bishop to g4. If knight c3, excuse me, then bishop to g4, and again, the pawn on d4 is going to fall. So bishop b4, he plays bishop to d2, and I played queen a5. And again, if this is taken, then he has the same problem. Cannot play queen d2 because I take the knight on a4. Cannot play knight d2 because I take on d4. If he trades, then bishop g4. Okay, so he plays knight c5, which I thought was sensible. And this is actually what I was calculating before queen b6. You can see that my b7 pawn is hanging. However, I have a tactical solution to this problem which gives me an extremely promising position, and that's bishop takes d2. Now, if knight takes d2, which may seem bad, I actually don't take on d4 straight away. This leads to all kinds of problems after knight takes b7, queen b4, knight d6 check. I don't want to allow the knight to come into d6. I gave up my bishop. I play knight g7 first. And now if knight takes b7, then queen a2 is possible. And d4 is hanging, the c6 knight is defended. Knight d6, I go king to f8. And I should be okay. This pawn is basically indefensible. Okay, but the critical variation was queen takes d2, which my opponent thought was much better for him. Again, fortunately for me, he didn't see a defensive resource. I did. So I take, he takes with the king, of course. If he takes with the knight in this position, then knight d4 is great. Okay, so king takes, and now the key move is rook to b8, which seems tactically completely unsound because of knight a6 or knight b7. However, the fact that the b2 pawn is hanging with check, and that the rook cannot be attacked because the b1 square is defended by the bishop, means that I simply start picking off pawns. So for example, if knight a6, ba6, rook c6, rook b2. If king c1, which seems to be the most promising move, threatening rook c8 or rook a6, then I simply go rook b1 check. And after king to d2, I go knight e7, preventing rook c8. And if, for example, rook a6, taking a pawn, then I castle and my position is overwhelming. You can see that rook c8 is coming, rook c2 is coming. White could be getting mated. It's really hard to develop these pieces. The engine says this is completely winning. Again, I thought it was better. I didn't think it was over. After rook b8, also knight takes b7 leads to the same kinds of positions. Same thing. Okay, so my opponent didn't do that, of course. He played rook to c3, which he wants to play rook b3. Not that it works, but okay, he wants to play rook b3. I played knight e7. Now these tricks are out of the question. Rook b3 doesn't really work because I have knight a5. So I don't know what to suggest. Let's see what the engine says about rook b3. Okay, rook b3. No, yeah, rook b3, bishop g4 straight away. Okay, yeah, okay. And pressure on d4. So same idea. Also bishop e4 is okay, removing the defender. But my opponent played bishop to e2. And now we come back to the strategic idea from the start of the video. And that's removing the defender of the d4 pawn and putting pressure on d4. And after bishop e2, I knew I was winning. The engine evaluation doesn't matter. What my opponent does doesn't really matter. I can simply win this position after bishop g4 because I have prepared positions like this and I knew the strategic ideas behind them, and the conversion is really simple, as you're going to see. So if he tries to save the knight with knight e1, then I can simply take on e2 and take on d4 with check. So that doesn't work. He cannot decline the trade. What else? If rook b3, I can take and take on d4. He played knight to b3, defending the d4 pawn, but it's simply not sufficient because I have more attackers coming in. So bishop takes. Now if he takes with the rook, which he did not do, then against knight f5, he could play rook f4. This is an awkward defense, but it's a defense. At least it holds for a moment. I could go king e7 and then h5, h4 if he doesn't block me. And if he does play h4, then knight b4 is annoying. But taking with the rook and playing rook f4 is really hard for humans to see. It took me a while to notice it in the analysis. He took with the bishop, and now I simply win material, regardless of what he does. If he plays rook d3, I go knight b4, take the a2 pawn, and then go back to b4, win the d4 pawn. If he plays king d3 as in the game, then simply knight b4, king d2, knight a2, and again, same thing happens. Rook c7 could be kind of annoying because my rook is loose once he doubles. So he did play rook c7. I played knight b4. He played rook hc1. So now I have to be careful about rook c8 check. Of course, if I don't do anything, then he takes on c8. He plays rook c8 and takes on h8. The problem with this is, let's say I do nothing. Rook c8, if I take, I lose the rook. If I go here, then I get mated. So while the pawn is on e5, I have to be careful about rook c8. So knight c6. And that's fine because I want to put pressure on d4 anyway. And I'm in no rush in this position. There's absolutely no rush. He played knight a5. Now again, if I win a piece, I either lose a rook or get mated. So knight a5, rook c8, king e7, rook 1 c7. Or knight a5, rook c8, king e7, rook h8. Okay, but I just took on d4, takes on d4, and now I'm threatening knight e5, which actually allows me to give up the c8 square. He played bishop to d1 here, which is kind of sensible. If he takes on b7, then I take on e5, and rook c8 now fails because of king e7, king f6. My rooks defend each other and my king runs away. He played bishop d1 though. And here I could take on e5. I didn't. I played castles because it's just a safer move. After castles I can never lose. But if I take on e5, then rook c8, king e7. And he either trades rooks or checks me again and I run away. So after bishop d1 I just castled. He took on b7. I took on e5, he played knight to d6, and I played again the simplest move, knight b5, just forcing a trade. So takes. He took on h5, I took on b2, he played king e3, knight c4 check, king f3, and g6 was the final move of the game. Here he resigned. If he plays bishop to g4, I win a pawn. So for example, bishop g4 is the only move. Bishop g4, knight e5, let's say king f4, let's say king g3. Okay, so takes, and takes. And obviously this is a very winning rook endgame. And that was the best that he could have done. So if you are struggling with the Tal, like I was, up to this game, remember this nice little idea with bishop to e7. Study the lines with knight f3 and g3. These are the easiest to refute. But if your opponent plays correctly with cd, and bishop to d3, then start preparing seriously. My opponent is almost 2100 and he blundered with bishop to g5, so not many people know this. Yeah, so again, I won. I finished on 4 out of 7. I had a plus score rating wise, and I won a cash prize. Woohoo! Okay, tomorrow I'm going to start showing you the games from Liberec, the tournament I played after this one. See you tomorrow. Hope you got something from the game. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.